Hello everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I am just waiting a few seconds. We're still not exactly on time yet, just a few minutes. And we'll chat to the most amazing person who is going to enlighten us about so many interesting things. I'm sure many of you would love to learn and discover. Thank you, familiar faces, and hi everyone. So nice to know that my friends are there for me. Hello everyone. Hello Jimmy. Just a few minutes. I will wait for a few more people to join. Thank you very much. And Victoria just requested, and I'm going to accept her. She should be joining us. Here you go. Good morning, Victoria.
Good morning to you. I'm so glad everything worked. I've been so
Oh my
nervous.
God, yes, it works perfectly. Yes, and you look gorgeous, fresh in the morning. How's New York?
It's very, very steamy today. It's going to be
Yes,
97 degrees, I'm told. So
I know, it's crazy. Yes, I spoke to my children this morning and they said, yes, this heat wave is coming, but we're used to it here, so it's not
of
something that
course.
uh, I don't know all about, but it's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for waking up early. But as you, as a journalist, I guess it's nothing new to you. I will
It's
say a
crazy.
few, yes, I will say a few words about conversations with Olga. I will introduce you to our listeners as well, and then we'll just chat.
Lovely. Sounds wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my honor and my pleasure. Thank you for joining me. Dear everyone, good morning in New York, good evening in Singapore and in Asia, and good afternoon in London and Europe. I just say a few words about my IGTV series, Conversations with Olga. I've started this series last year during the circuit breaker, as I had so much time, and I decided to connect to my friends and amazing individuals from all around the world and to share their life stories and their journey, and in hopes to introduce and inspire our multinational and multicultural Singaporean community and world community as well, and to cultivate more diversity and more inclusivity all around the world. So today we have a very, very beautiful and important guest for my episode number 20, Victoria Arbiter. Victoria is a royal contributor, and I will say a few words about her biography in general, and then we'll move on. I'll put my glasses on. Victoria has been a journalist and royal commentator since 2011, covering major events surrounding the British royal family. In 2012, she covered the Queen's Diamond Jubilee celebration live from London for ABC News, and 2011, she spent 4 months in England covering the lead up for William and Catherine's wedding for CBS News, and in 2018, she covered Harry and Meghan's nuptials as well from Windsor with Anderson Cooper. Victoria is a regular contributor to Entertainment Tonight's Inside Edition, the Today Show, CTV, Channel 7 Australia, and ITV UK. She writes a weekly royal column for 9 Honey, the digital arm of Channel 9 in Australia, and she's been featured in numerous international publications and documentaries. Her book on Queen Elizabeth II for the Pocket Giants series was published by the History Press in February 2016. Victoria, you also acted as reporters in the feature film Non-Stop, starring Liam Neeson, and the hit TV shows Madam Secretary, Person of Interest, and Royal Pains. Well, before we start our conversation, I need to basically make a disclaimer. I would love to plan another interview with you because we are not able to cover even a small part of the topics that I would love to talk to you about. So, and to hear your opinions about. So I just wanted to have it publicly announced. Um, well, first of all, thank you once again for joining me this morning. And I would like to have a few questions to you about growing up and your heritage. You were born in Zimbabwe, raised in Windsor, England, before moving to Kensington Palace when you were in your teens. Just for all of you, our listeners, I would like to let you know that Victoria is the daughter of D.K. Arbiter, a career journalist, and the former press secretary to Queen Elizabeth II. I believe he was one of the first court correspondents, if I'm correct, and he was with the royal court for most of his career. So obviously he had a huge influence on you, I believe, and you traveled the world with him and accompanied him in so many noble state occasions. Can you tell us a little bit about the influence of your father on the chosen career, please?
Yes, well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Olga. It's interesting. I never actually set out to be in the royal sphere, but I think it's all I've really ever known. Yes, I was born in Zimbabwe, but my parents left there when I was about 6 weeks old, moved to England, where my father became a journalist with LBC, which is a talk radio station in London. He loved his job there, and he gravitated really towards the royals. They put him on the royal beat, and it was right a few years later that Diana hit the scene in 1980, and suddenly there was this voracious appetite for royal news, and it was the first time the stations in the UK really thought we need a specific court related correspondent, and so that's what he did. And so our life was just completely dictated by the royal calendar. On Christmas morning, he would have to go and be at Windsor Castle, which is where the royal family celebrated Christmas at the time. And everything was always, our life kind of had to fit in around what the royals were doing. But it meant that I kind of was assimilated in this world really just because it's what my dad did. Kids aren't ever terribly impressed by their parents' professions. They just go off to work and it's who's going to cook you dinner at the end of the day. And so I sort of was learning all this royal history because my dad is he would say, I'm not being rude, he would call himself a history nerd. He is a geek. If anyone who's watching has ever seen the Disney film Beauty and the Beast, there's Cogsworth who walks around the big mansion pointing, well, that's my dad. It's like over here in 1916, whatever, and over here, the history of, it's there's always history and it was always being talked about in our house. And so we cut to my late teens, where he was invited to take up residence at Kensington Palace. At the time, they don't do it anymore, but they had Buckingham Palace offered what they called grace and favour apartments, where you could live within a royal residence if you held a certain position. And so that's where we were living for a time. And again, it's only in hindsight I can kind of appreciate what an honour that was. But I think living at Kensington Palace, people will so often say, what's it like? What's it like? Well, it's kind of the way I liken it is to a very regal version of Melrose Place. Anyone that saw that soap opera in the 80s and 90s, it's kind of a very grand apartment complex. But we lived in the old stable block that was not grand at all. It was quite a small flat. But we called it home, and it was lovely. But then many years later, when William and Kate got engaged, I had been working in television for a long time. I'd been hosting a travel show. I'd worked as an entertainment reporter. I hosted a travel food and culture show, all these sort of different style shows. And when William and Kate got engaged, there was a morning show called the CBS Early Show, and they were looking for someone to do their royal coverage. And they reached out to me, having seen my television work, and said, do you know all this stuff about the royals? And I was like,
That's probably all what I know.
Yeah. I don't know. Do I? But then I started thinking, I was like, well, yes, I kind of know all this stuff. And I have a unique insight, having lived at Kensington Palace. And because my dad was a journalist, but he also worked for the royal household. He was the press secretary to Charles and Diana for many years. He then moved to the Queen's press office. So it's kind of what I've always known. So I'm pretty useless with other trivia, but if it's royal based, I've got a pretty good handle on things.
Well, I'm pretty sure this is not exactly what it is, that you're not useless in so many things, and you need to know history, and you need to know literature, and you need to know manners, and then etiquette, and so many things. So it's very worldwide knowledge that you need to possess. So by saying that, thank you so much for enlightening us about your growing up years. Well, I'll be asking you questions, of course, about the members of the royal family, the passing of Prince Philip, the Queen Elizabeth, and of course, and the recent scandals. A little bit as well. And there has been a lot of coverage in news lately about the royal family with the Prince Philip's passing, and of course, an Oprah's famous interview and the birth of the second child of Meghan and Harry. But let's start with the questions about Prince Philip, if it's okay. As many of us actually have learned a great deal about him, or more than we knew before, after he passed away. So did you know Prince Philip personally?
No, I didn't meet Prince Philip personally. Obviously, my father spent a fair bit of time with him, and my father always respected him enormously. I think Prince Philip often sort of got a bad rap. He was fiercely private. He was all about duty. He served his country with distinction. But I think because sometimes he could appear to be quite gruff, I think he was a rather misunderstood member of the royal family. And it was only after his death when you start learning about everything that he contributed, his bravery during the war. He was mentioned in dispatches for his bravery during World War II. He was a very proud naval officer. He was a unique individual, but of that generation where service and duty to country comes before all else. And so it's been wonderful to see these tributes following his death, but I just hope that he knew during his lifetime how well respected and admired he was.
Yes, because you're right, and there are some misconceptions that the people have about him. To be honest with you, I personally met him. I was very lucky because I helped Queen Elizabeth at one point when she visited Singapore, and I did meet Prince Philip. And of course, he's super different character from his wife, but nevertheless, he's a bigger than life. I remember him as a bigger than life, as a personality. Do you have any story that might change perhaps these misconceptions, that some anecdote that you might want to share with us about him?
Sure. Actually, this is one of my favorite stories about Prince Philip, actually, and it really just speaks to his humanity and his compassion. Prince Philip had a very difficult childhood, and I think it just made him much more sensitive to the difficulties experienced by other people. Now, back in the 80s, the Tory party were holding their conference in Brighton at a hotel in Brighton, and very scarily, a bomb went off in that hotel. There was tremendous injury caused, tremendous damage caused. It was a huge story at the time. And there was an MP there for the Conservative Party, Norman Tebbit, and his wife was very seriously injured in the Brighton bombing. Well, many years later, Norman Tebbit and his wife were invited to Buckingham Palace for a state dinner. And these are very grand affairs with very important, well-to-do VIPs. And there's a lot of pressure at attending one of those types of events. And Mr. Tebbit called Buckingham Palace and said his wife was very anxious about attending this. She experienced some form of paralysis. Holding a knife and fork was very difficult for her. She didn't want to let the side down. She was embarrassed. She was worried about it. And Buckingham Palace said, don't worry, everything will be fine. Well, on the night of the banquet, I've got goosebumps actually telling you this story.
I have goosebumps, yes.
Oh, I love this story. So she gets to Buckingham Palace to find that she's been seated next to Prince Philip, and she was horrified. Oh my gosh, she was so worried about how she was going to conduct herself as the evening progressed. Well, they came along and they served the food, and they put the plate of food in front of Prince Philip. He handed his knife and fork to the man who gave him his plate of food, and he picked up his food with his fingers, which then meant that Mrs. Tebbit had permission to pick up her food with her fingers. Now, this wasn't an accident. Of course, this had been designed. The Buckingham Palace chefs had been made aware, and they'd been told to prepare the kind of food that you could eat with your fingers. You know, they didn't serve a bowl of soup. But I just think it's remarkable that Prince Philip didn't have to say a word. He didn't
Yeah,
have to say anything to
yeah.
her that would perhaps make her self-conscious. It was through his actions that he put her at ease. And I just think it really speaks to the kind of man he
Absolutely.
was.
Thank you for sharing it. That's why it's another proof that how actions actually manifest the character rather than the words. Absolutely. And how
That's
body
such a great
language.
point. Yeah, I think
Yes.
that's the way you surmise that is excellent, Olga. I think you're exactly right.
Yes, I strongly believe in it. And I'm very, in general, I'm very personal person. So for me, it's very important to observe the body language and that expresses more than words, so as actions. And talking about the body language, I felt that it was something absolutely extraordinary during his funeral that I've observed how the Queen's demeanor at the funeral. Perhaps you can share with us what are the elements of her expression of grief. As to me, it was so warm. It was really solitude of love and extremely humble. Can you please comment on some of the body language and some of the unseen, unknown elements of it?
Sure. Well, of course, it's very difficult for members of the royal family because they have to share, they try not to share too much of their private lives. Obviously,
Yes,
they should be afforded some form of privacy just because they're
yes,
public figures. But at the same time, there are these very personal occasions that they do have to share with the world. So, weddings, for example, William and Kate would have loved, I think, to have a very private wedding, but they had to share it with the world. We're
yes,
glad they did. But the
yes,
funeral was one of those such occasions. Now, the royal family has a phrase, you don't wear your private grief on a public sleeve. And I think anyone who's familiar with the British stiff upper lip knows that there's a certain way the British like to carry themselves. It was why it was so extraordinary when Diana, Princess of Wales, passed away to see these huge expressions of grief. It's not what the
yes,
British public do. But I think what we saw at Prince Philip's funeral, the Queen was so composed. She, in a sense, having to sit there in St. George's Chapel on her own, she represented all the other families across the UK who had
yeah,
had to go to funerals and sit by themselves because of the restrictions relating to coronavirus. It was such a dignified, it was a beautiful service. It's exactly
beautiful.
what Prince Philip would have wanted. But my goodness, wasn't it heartbreaking to look at the Queen? She was
Yes,
almost, at that point, 95 years old. She'd lost her spouse of 73 years. She met Prince Philip when she was only 8 years old. And having to sit in St. George's Chapel alone like that. But she wouldn't have wanted any special favors. A lot of people said, she's the Queen, can't someone sit with her? But no, it's because she's the Queen that she has to observe the same rules as everybody else.
yeah,
I don't think anyone could have been upset with her if she had had someone sitting next to her. But she wouldn't have wanted it that
yeah,
way because it wouldn't have been a fair representation
yeah.
to the rest of the country.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And, I would like to ask a little bit more about, well, a lot more about the time limitations about the Queen Elizabeth as a monarch, as a mother, as a wife, as a leader, and as a personality that might not be visible to many of us or most of us. Of course, it will require, as I said, a lot of many conversations, but if you can summarize for us perhaps a little bit, like in a few minutes, some of the main characteristics or character traits of Queen Elizabeth, I would appreciate that.
Well, I think anyone who's followed her reign, her record-breaking reign, next year she marks 70 years as Queen. She broke Queen Victoria's record as the
Yeah,
longest-serving monarch in British history in 2015. So she's a remarkable individual, particularly because when she was born, no one ever thought she would be monarch. Of course, the abdication crisis led us to where we are today. I think people looking at her know she's a master of diplomacy. She's all about duty and compassion, and there's a regalness to her that you really can't teach. But I think
yes,
what people don't know, she has a great sense of humor. She doesn't show expressions on her face because she knows that if a photograph is taken, it will be interpreted by analysts, by the
yeah,
newspapers, by the tabloids, by social media. There's all these people that would then want to put words in her mouth. So she keeps a very neutral expression, but behind the scenes, she's got a great sense of humor and she's a very good mimic. She loves acting. She loves musical theatre. Oklahoma is one of her most favorite musicals. She loves it. She loves those old sort of fashioned musicals. And she's a very good actress. When she
Yes,
and
that's what
her
I approach. She's a closet actress.
That's
Yes.
right. Yes, when she and her sister, Princess Margaret, they were required to live at Windsor Castle during the war. And at Christmas, they would put on Christmas shows, pantomimes, we call them in the UK. She did,
Yes.
Aladdin was one of them. And she would write the scripts and she would tell everyone what they had to do. And Princess Margaret was instructed to be one of the actors in it, and the Queen would be one of the actors in it. And I think they just brought a lot of cheer to the people during the war years that were sequestered away at Windsor Castle. So, I think you see elements of her sense of humor. Just recently, when the G7 summit was held in the UK just a couple of weeks ago, she held a reception for leaders, and she also attended a celebration lunch for the big lunch. And
Yes.
she insisted on cutting the cake with a ceremonial sword versus a standard knife. And they said, Mom, we do have a regular knife. And she said, yes, but this is more unusual. And of course, then you've got the Queen, who's quite little in height, and she's wielding this great sword trying to cut a cake. But I think she recognizes as well that people want the show. They want the full royal experience. And that's what
Yes.
she offers. But she's never about self. And I think that's the other quality I would really like people to
Remarkable.
understand
Yes.
about her, is her humility is extraordinary.
And and on this kind of on the same line, I've heard that she's a very good photographer as well. And
Yeah.
if you can share, and she took, I believe, a lot of photographs even during her travel, and some of them are quite really treasured possessions that been shown, I think, during the.
Yeah, well, it's fantastic actually, because of course we want to document the
Yes.
history of the monarchy, and there's a lot that happens behind the scenes that we don't get to see. And so there's a lot of her photographs that historians will be able to pore over many, many years from
Yeah.
now when she's no longer with us. But how fantastic that she has so well documented what life is like as monarch and life behind palace walls. She doesn't go anywhere without her camera. She always used to take a cine camera with her as well. And so there's phenomenal footage. Several years ago, Buckingham Palace, as part of their summer exhibition, they focused on royal childhoods. And a lot of that really early cine film of her children on board Britannia, clowning around with the yachtsmen, sliding down the water slides, playing games on
Yeah.
board the ship. And I think that video is all so special, and we're so fortunate that she has recorded history the way she has.
Of course, and it makes her so real. It's remarkable, of course, but she is a real person, and
Yes, it's easy to forget, isn't it? Because she's such
yes,
a
yes,
remarkable person. But yes, she's a very
exactly.
human, very real.
And I've heard another story that she's one person in the world, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mandela, who called her actually by her first name, by Elizabeth, and when she visited the Africa, I believe the tour to Africa was just before Philip has asked her to marry him. And I think the secret was kept. What was that particular relationship with Nelson Mandela that made her allow him to call her by her first name?
They shared a very warm friendship. They really did. I think she admired Nelson Mandela enormously. Now, as you mentioned, she went to Southern Africa in 1947. It was her first international trip. She went with her parents and her sister, Margaret. She didn't return to the country of South Africa until apartheid had been wiped out. Now, the Queen, of course, is required to remain politically neutral. She couldn't have come out and spoken against apartheid, but it's another example of somebody's actions speaking to how they feel about something. So in 1995, she finally returned to South Africa. Nelson Mandela was the first democratically elected African head of state in South Africa. And I think she just admired him so much, everything he had been through, everything he stood for, and that he had won his seat in a democratic election. It really spoke to everything that's important to the Queen. And I think it also spoke to how she has tried to bring the Commonwealth together. One of Nelson Mandela's first actions as the newly elected president was to request for South Africa to rejoin the Commonwealth, which again sort of speaks to his fondness for her and what he understood she was trying to achieve with the Commonwealth, which is to bring all these nations together. They're voluntary organizations. It was sort of the crumbling of the empire evolved into the Commonwealth, and people, they join because they want to join. And so, yes, Nelson Mandela was the only head of state that called her Elizabeth. I don't know if one day he just did it and she didn't bother to correct him. But I think she was quite happy for him
Yes.
to call her that. You know, that again, these protocols exist and these conventions exist in order for people to understand sort of how to behave. But if you
Yes.
break one of those rules, the Queen really doesn't care. You're
Yes.
not going to be sent off to the tower. They're really just there to
Absolutely.
help people navigate. How do you meet
Yes.
the Queen? What do you call her? How do you behave in front of her? But, you know, if people slip, it's okay.
It's exactly what happened with me actually, and I don't want to take too much time about it, but I was sworn to secrecy, and I did meet Queen Elizabeth in Singapore, and Prince Philip as well, and I had to do certain things with her, and at the little room or the waiting room, and she was there, and I was of course told what to do and what not to do, and not to talk to her unless she starts talking to me, and of course I obliged, and I did do courtesy, although I was not required to do so because I'm
Yeah.
not a British citizen, but nevertheless, she started to talk to me immediately. I was like after a few minutes being there, and I was a little bit awkward, but she was just normal, nice, beautiful person. It's the most exceptional skin, and I will ask you about this
Yes.
a bit later. I've never
And
seen a person with such a translucent skin.
did she put you at ease right away, Olga? You felt comfortable?
Right away, she commented on my outfit, and she asked me, personal questions immediately. Immediately, yes.
It
And there
just
were
goes to
only like
show.
maybe 5 people in the room, so yes.
Yeah, and I think people forget this too. It's like she doesn't just show up, she's prepared. She will have done her homework, she will have made sure to know a little bit about everybody that she was going to meet. And it's remarkable that she's still doing that at
Yeah.
95 years old. But I love that she asked you what you wore because, of course, at
Yes.
the end of the day, she's a girl. We all love our fashion, don't we? We all love our clothes.
Yes.
And, you
Well,
know,
that
that,
suit's still in my closet,
of course,
reserved.
you can't, of course, you've got to keep
Yes.
that forever.
Yes. Exactly. By any chance, have you remember any comments or commentaries that the Queen might have shared with British with public about her trip to Singapore at that time? It was on a way to inform New Zealand for the Commonwealth Games.
Yes, no, I'm afraid I don't know, Olga, but
Yes.
I know she will have enjoyed it. She loves to go and visit. At the end of the day, she is a homebody. If she could be anywhere, she'd probably be at Balmoral, her estate, her
Mm.
privately owned estate in Scotland. She loves her home. Like when she goes on holiday, she goes to Scotland. She's not going off
Yeah.
to exotic islands like other people might. But she really does love to, or she doesn't travel internationally now, but she loved seeing the world and meeting people from different cultures and diverse backgrounds and people of
Yes.
different
Yes.
faiths and religions and beliefs. And she really epitomized everything in terms of equality and acceptance. And I think
Yeah.
that has been really what has driven her
Yes.
to make sure that the Commonwealth continues to endure, because it means so much to her that people be afforded equal rights and an
Yes.
equal place in society.
That's yes, it's incredible, and I can feel it. I can see it. Uh, can you tell us a little bit about Queen's relationship with the late Princess Diana? And just quite recently, I saw again. I just was watching the funeral of Princess Diana, and there was one. Element that I was really I paid attention, and of course I would like you to point out there was something special about her behavior at that particular moment.
I'm so glad you raised this, Olga, because unfortunately, in this day and age, with news traveling as fast as it does, stories get out there that aren't corrected and myths quickly become fact. And
Yeah.
Buckingham Palace simply doesn't have enough time in the day to go around correcting every false story over the last 70
Yes.
years of the Queen's reign. And so this false narrative has kind of developed that the Queen didn't like Diana, and that is simply not
Yeah.
true. It is so far from the truth. The Spencer family had long been closely associated to the Windsor family. Diana was born at Park House, which is on the Sandringham estate, which is the Queen's privately owned estate. And the Spencers and the Windsors have long shared a mutually respectful, close relationship. But I think the moment you're referring to is when Diana's funeral procession, it left from Kensington Palace, and it's a long walk to Westminster Abbey. But on that walk, the gun carriage passed by Buckingham Palace. And as it did, the entire royal family came out of Buckingham Palace to stand on the street and pay their respects as the coffin moved past. And as it did, the Queen bowed her head. Now, people might think, okay, so what? But she's the Queen. She doesn't bow to anybody, not to anybody.
Yes.
And so it was a tremendous mark of respect, and her personal respect, that she bowed as Diana's coffin moved past. And as she did, the rest of the family followed suit. And I think the Queen, you know, in hindsight, we can all say the things we wish we had done differently, or the way we wish we had approached a situation. But she really did try to help Diana. She was very sympathetic to her cause. And one example, I think it was in 1981, the press were just hounding Diana. There was an insatiable appetite for Diana news. She was on the front page of the papers almost every day. And the Queen called a press conference at Buckingham Palace, and it was for newspaper editors. And the reason she called it was to ask them to leave Diana alone, to just give her a bit of space. And one of the newspaper, and she said to them, you know, she can't even go out and buy a packet of sweets without you following her. And one of the newspaper editors said, can't she send a footman for the sweets? And the Queen was appalled that he would say something in such a cavalier fashion, and she shot him down pretty quickly. Anyway, I think she was hoping that this meeting would at least relieve some of the stress on Diana, but it didn't. All it did was further fuel the interest. And it was just a few weeks later, pictures of Diana on the beach in the Caribbean in a bikini with the start of her baby bump. She was pregnant with William, was flashed across the front pages of the newspapers. So the Queen did try, but every time she tried, it just further fueled the interest.
Yes, it's unfortunate, and it's very sad at the same time. Victoria, before we talk about the present day's happenings of the royal family, perhaps it might be important and interesting for all of our listeners just to know a little bit more about the main functions and duties of a monarchy. And if there's because there are obviously a lot of misconceptions about the role of the monarchy. Can you please enlighten us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the Queen's role as head of state is to provide a focus for national unity. So she is someone that the nation turns to in good times and in bad. And I think anyone who's watching, who's got an interest in the royal family, will remember those moments where she's on the balcony at Buckingham Palace and there's hundreds of thousands of people lining the mall and you know, causing great excitement. During the Olympics, anyone that remembers the UK hosting the Olympics, when there was that skit with James Bond and the Queen in the opening ceremony, and we were led to believe she was jumping out of a plane with a parachute. There's a sort of the times where we turn to her at a time of focus for national pride and excitement and happiness. But we also turn to her at times of national sadness. So Remembrance Sunday every year, a commemorative event remembering Britain's war dead and war dead around the Commonwealth. And she's the one that leads the commemorations at the Cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday. When something bad happens, you know, the Grenfell Tower disaster several years ago, it was the Queen that went out and met the people who had lost family members during that time. She'll give a public address, as she did, very rare to do a public address other than at Christmas, but on April 5th last year with the coronavirus pandemic, when it was just getting underway, she gave a public address on television and millions of people tuned in because they wanted guidance from the Queen. Exactly. She's who we turn to. But her role is also to reward good deeds. And that's one of her favorite things to do, actually. She loves recognizing people who have served their community well or who have shown great bravery during battle, who have, I guess, gone beyond their own means to help other people. Yes. And really, the Queen, I think the beauty of her serving as a politically neutral head of state, it means that everything she does comes without all the political gubbins. You know, if a politician shows up at a disaster, often they're serving their own cause as well. They're trying to appeal to people to get votes. When the Queen shows up, she's there totally in a humanitarian sense. She's there to offer comfort, to give people a distraction, to offer her support. And that's what I particularly like about the monarchy, is the fact that it is very separate from politics. So it doesn't come with all the same baggage.
Exactly. And also, needless to say that they've been helping so much. They're being patrons of so many important charities, and I believe it really makes a huge difference. And how valuable is the involvement in raising the funds for causes, you think?
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. So, for example, let's say the Duchess of Cambridge shows up at an event. Chances are her picture is going to be on the front pages of the newspapers the next day. So not only has she drawn focus to that particular charity that she's visiting, but she's also going to help drive fundraising, which is incredibly valuable, particularly right now with charities are suffering terribly in the wake of the pandemic, because people have lost their jobs. They're not donating in the same way they used to. The royals haven't been able to show up at functions or fundraising dinners where a lot of money would be raised. But not only do they help the fundraising efforts, they also drive volunteer efforts. They also raise the profile. For example, let's say the Duchess of Cambridge highlights the work of a hospice or a children's hospice. So people are then going to be inspired to volunteer at that hospice. They might donate to that hospice. They might give goods to the hospice. Or there could be a family that, heaven forbid, is coping with the illness of a sick child. They then know where to turn to for help and guidance. And so it offers resources. And really having a member of the royal family serve as a patron for your charity is incredibly valuable. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes. We shall move a little bit and talk about other members of the family. Prince Charles. Tell us a little bit about his character. Is he a forward-thinking person? And just enlighten us a little bit, because it's also there are some misconceptions about him and whether he will be leaving the lasting legacy, for example.
Prince Charles is a remarkable man. I'm so glad you raised him, because, of course, Prince Charles just constantly is seen against the backdrop of his failed marriage and his relationship with the Duchess of Cornwall, formerly Camilla Parker Bowles. And I feel terribly for Prince Charles, because he is as devoted to the welfare of the nation, and particularly young people, as his parents before him and as the extended royal family are. The Prince's Trust, which has been around for well over 40 years, has made a massive contribution to the lives of so many young people, people that perhaps would have ended up in prison because of the path they were going down, but instead they were granted opportunities through the Prince's Trust. And today they sit as CEOs of their own companies, and they are employing other people and helping other people. So the legacy of the Prince's Trust is absolutely remarkable. But also Prince Charles is an incredibly forward-thinking man. He was preaching about the dangers of plastics well over 40 years ago. He was preaching about the need for religious tolerance many, many years ago. He was talking about how important it is from people from all faiths to be able to live side by side, shoulder to shoulder, to be able to come together in a form of respect, not fighting. And so I think it's only now that people are beginning to recognize that Prince Charles was seeing things years ago, and he was ridiculed for them, and he just took it on the chin and said, okay. He never, ever fights back. And I think that's quite interesting about Prince Charles. No matter what people think about his relationship with Diana, he has never talked badly about her in public. He's never defended himself. He's never tried to sway public opinion. He just keeps on doing the job, and he lets the job speak for itself. And I think as well, we have to remember that Prince Charles has been in a unique position because he is the longest serving heir apparent in history. He's going to come to the throne very late in life. And it's tricky too, because he only gets that job because his mother's passed away. And people forget that that role comes at enormous cost and an enormous sacrifice. That would really do a number on you emotionally and mentally, to think you're only going to get the job for which you're destined because your mother has died. Who else sort of lives like that? So I think Prince Charles's legacy is one of those that sadly will only really truly be understood and recognized after he's passed away. But I hope people start to appreciate him and look at everything he's accomplished, because we are all the sum of all parts. We are not one mistake. We are not one bad judgment in our lives. There is so much that makes up all of us. And that same goes for Prince Charles.
I'm so glad you said that, and I'm so glad that you shared this because, as once again, there are misconceptions and there are judgments. I think it's probably, unfortunately, human nature. So it's really nice
Yeah.
to listen and to hear about his qualities that are of a purely noble man. What you shared about him not fighting back, it's definitely an expression of his personality as a strong personality and noble man. And thank you so much. Do you think that he will change certain work tasks and responsibilities when he will come to throne for the royals?
I think he'll certainly sort of try to make his own personal mark. He's not going to have a chance to leave a legacy quite like his
Yes.
mother's as sovereign. His legacy really will be that as Prince of Wales. But I think what he is going to do, and there's been no secret about this, there's been a lot of controversy around it, but Prince Charles has long talked about his desire for a slimmed down monarchy.
Yeah.
Now, what he means by that is he's very cognizant that the monarchy has to continue to appeal to the generations that are coming up behind. And the British people don't want to be responsible for funding what we call the strap hangers, paying people that do a couple of engagements a year, or just sort of this huge number of people that sort of make up the extended royal family right now. So he wants to streamline the focus, really, in a sense, to try and make it relevant to today's generation. The
Yes.
problem with that, where this becomes difficult, is when you start looking at the duties of the royal family. So there are the engagements that each of them do on an individual basis each year. Then there are the engagements they do on behalf of the Commonwealth. There are 15 other Commonwealth realms beyond the UK, and the Commonwealth of Nations is made up of 54 nations. There are the events that they do on behalf of the nation. So Trooping the Colour each year, Remembrance Sunday each year, the Garter ceremony, there's all of those types of engagements. So when we start looking at everything they're responsible for, only four people, Charles, Camilla, William, and Kate, to be doing all of that, it's too much. So I think we
Tremendous.
are going to see a continued involvement from Princess Anne.
Yeah.
She's another very hard, very working member of the family, incredibly impressive lady. And Edward and Sophie as well are going to be picking up a lot of that work as well, because Charles, Camilla, William, and Kate simply can't do it all.
Yes.
They'd need to have clones of themselves that they could
Yes.
sort of send out around the world. So I think it's to be admired that Prince Charles recognizes that they need to streamline things, but it can't be done to the detriment of their responsibilities. Because, for example, when the Queen passes away, she's patron or involved in more than 800 charitable organizations. Well, what happens to all of those charities? So there's those things that'll have to be
Yes.
ironed out as well.
Well, let's say, monarchy is a business, it's a
That's
corporation.
right.
Has
Yes.
to
Yeah.
be, and has to be managed. And like in every, I guess, company or corporation, when the new CEO comes on board, changes happen. So
Yeah.
that's it. I totally understand that. Well, it brings me right now to the point where I would like to ask you about the monarchy's recent scandals. And the facial expression I understand, and and it's totally up to your discretion, and you will express your opinions as much or as little as you want. So, and you have been on the interview yourself. We'll talk a little bit about the interview. You've been interviewed by Oprah yourself, and you know how straight and how sometimes imposing she could be in general. What is your take on Harry's and Meghan's interview, and what would you like to share? And in general, what is your take on and your opinion on their marriage in general?
I think, if Harry and Meghan were going to give an interview, which of course they ended up doing, the person they were always going to turn to was Oprah Winfrey. She's incredibly well respected in her field. She's hugely admired. She has, my goodness, her success that she has achieved is phenomenal. But she's done so in a very dignified fashion. There's nothing tabloidy or salacious about Oprah Winfrey. She's very above board. And I think there's people from all walks of life respect Oprah Winfrey. So I think in terms of who was going to do the interview, Oprah made perfect sense. Now, personally speaking, do I wish they hadn't done the interview? Yes, probably, only because of the fallout that has happened since. And we only have to look back over history to see that tell-all one-on-one interviews like this, generally they cause a lot of problems. Look, in 1994, Prince Charles was interviewed by Jonathan Dimbleby. He did so in an effort to try and appeal to the British public, but it backfired spectacularly. Yes. It caused huge trouble for Prince Charles and actually solidified him as the royal family's villain for a number of years. Diana did her Panorama interview famously in 1995, and same thing. I think she thought it was her only outlet at the time and she was desperate to have her say. But the fallout that transpired as a result was gargantuan.
Yes.
Prince Andrew's interview. Prince Andrew is another story altogether.
Yes.
He's
come to him a little bit. Yes.
Yes. But again, his interview backfired spectacularly.
Yes.
I don't know what he was thinking in doing that interview. So with Harry and Meghan, I have sympathy that they felt that they didn't have an outlet to share their side of the story. They wanted to put it out there. They are not the first royals who have wanted to do that, and I understand their desire to do so. I really do. It is horrible when the newspapers are full of inaccurate stories and you want to set the record straight. Unfortunately, what happens is you give a nugget of information, well, then people analyze that and interpret it, and they speculate upon it, and then people get on social media and they weave their own version of events, and suddenly this starts to snowball and it escalates and escalates and escalates. So someone might have said one thing, but then over the course of a week it's evolved into something else entirely. And unfortunately that's what tends to happen with these types of interviews.
I totally agree, and at one point or another during the day, and it happens to me several times, I despise social media, and I absolutely yes, it's could be pretty devastating. Do you think the royal family will reunite at one point?
I hope they do, Olga. I sincerely hope they do. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat things. Things are bad right now. They are. There's been so much said. There's been so much damage caused. We've heard from Harry and Meghan. We've heard their side of the story. The royal family isn't able to answer back. They don't respond. And the reason they don't respond is for the reasons we just talked about, is that the story, it then just escalates and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it just spirals out of control. I think there's a lot of hurt, and we have to remember that, yes, they're the royal family and we sort of separate them from real life, but they are real people with very human feelings, with emotional flaws, with characteristic flaws. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to have highs. They're going to have lows. But at the end of the day, Harry and William have historically always been incredibly close. They're the only two people on the planet that have experienced what they have experienced, and they are the only two people that know what the other one has been through and what it feels to go through that together. And I think it would be a tragedy if they weren't able to find their way back. It's going to take time. And it's difficult with them living in different countries, because with the time zones and everything, it's hard to try and make your peace in a phone call or over FaceTime. You kind of need to be in a room to just hash it all out. It's going to take time. But I think it would be a tragedy if they didn't heal from this.
I hope so too. I've heard from some press, well, once again, it's, a lot of press and social media, and you have to see through that Princess Diana has been compared, in a sense, to Meghan. Do you think there's some parallel between Princess Diana and Diana's treatment from the media, and in comparison to Meghan's treatment with the media?
There's certainly an insatiable appetite. Harry and Meghan continue to be in the papers all the time, even if they're not doing anything. So in that regard, yes, there's certainly a lot of interest. But I think where their journeys do differ significantly is that Diana was literally hounded. She couldn't get out of her car without being followed by photographers. There were paparazzi running after her when she walked out of the gym. Now, Diana played a bit of a tricky game, because there were times where she called the press and told them where she was going to be. And the minute you've opened that door to them, it's very difficult to close that door again. And so Diana kind of played a bit of a game of cat and mouse. The difference with Harry and Meghan is that the laws have changed significantly in the UK following Diana's death. So the press are not allowed to chase after them in the same way. They're not allowed to take paparazzi pictures of them. A couple made it into the papers, but very, very few when you compare it to Diana. So there is certainly some parallels in terms of the appetite for information. But I think what's perhaps harder for Harry and Meghan is that they're dealing with this online news now as well. So the speed with which news travels means that a story is around the world within a nanosecond, but also these articles, they're all fighting for attention. So the headlines get more and more ridiculous just to inspire people to click on that story. So we have clickbait. Now, Diana didn't deal with clickbait, but I think the clickbait element has been particularly insidious for Harry and Meghan because the headlines get more and more outrageous just to try and get attention. And that's why these stories then spiral out of control as well. So each certainly dealt with the pitfalls of the media, but I think they were very different pitfalls.
Yes, I agree. And what is, on your opinion, is the biggest scandal in the British monarchy history, in history of the British monarchy?
Gosh, well, I think if we're looking at the history, I suppose the one that had the
Wallace Simpson?
I would
called
say
the femme fatale?
I think it would be the abdication crisis. The very idea that a king would give up his throne, give up serving the people for the woman he loved. I mean, on the one hand, if it were a romance movie, it would sound so romantic, but also, my gosh, it threw the monarchy into total tailspin. Now, the upside of it is that it resulted in us having the monarch we have today, and she's been remarkable. But yes, I think, to me, as scandals go, now, of course, there were all the tabloid scandals of the 80s, all the tapes that were recorded and compromising photographs that were taken. But I think the abdication crisis, as scandals goes, the biggest.
Probably the biggest. I agree. A few words on Prince Andrew. Has his reputation been fundamentally different from what it is now after the speculations about his connections with Jeffrey Epstein?
I think Prince Andrew, he's certainly with the media, he's never been terribly popular. He's an arrogant man. He's not terribly pleasant. I think before we talk about him, we do have to be clear that to date, he's not been charged or investigated or convicted of any crime. Certainly we know about his involvement with Jeffrey Epstein, but until the police come forward and offer more, then we do have to assume innocence until proven guilty. What Prince Andrew has been guilty of, there's no question, is appalling judgment when it comes to friends. The very idea of him maintaining a friendship with Jeffrey Epstein after he'd already served time in prison for procuring underage girls for prostitution is monstrous. And the lack of remorse that he showed during his interview for BBC Newsnight was appalling, absolutely appalling. Prince Andrew, in terms of a public life, is finished. There is no way back for him. Absolutely not. The British public wouldn't have it. There's no room for him. Now, he's relatively young in terms of the royal family. The Queen's still working at 95. You know, what does he do with the rest of his life? I don't know. Only Prince Andrew can figure that out. But the public doesn't want any part of him, and rightly so. At the same time, I think we have to recognize as well that there's been a lot of focus on Prince Andrew's involvement with Jeffrey Epstein, but there's an awful lot of other powerful figures that were involved in this circle that nobody's talking about. And so...
Well, it's a sensational point of, because he's Prince Andrew, so that's another point of the social media and yes, unfortunately, the gossip and myths and gossips versus what's really the case.
But I think if Olga, if we're looking for the ways we all view the royal family is always going to be a divisive institution. They're going to be pro-monarchy, anti-monarchy. But I think we all agree on Prince Andrew. None of us like him. None of us care for him. And I think really he's done the best thing he could possibly do, which is to step down and step back and keep out of the public eye.
Well, I think we should move to much happier occasion, discussions for the occasions, royal weddings. I believe you have covered many of the major weddings of the royal family. which one was your which one was your most favorite and most exceptional, on your opinion?
Well, the weddings that I've covered sort of in terms of the global scale and interest were William and Kate, obviously, and Harry and Meghan. I've
Yes.
talked about the others, but they weren't televised in quite the same fashion. I loved them both. They were both very different. William and Kate's, of course, was the full shebang in London, and it was the first royal wedding of that magnitude, really, since 1986 when Andrew and Fergie married. So in that regard, it was very exciting, and just the grandeur of it and the millions of people that flocked into London for it, and sort of the sense of occasion and the pomp and the pageantry. You know, I hope people won't be cross with me when I say no one does that stuff quite like the British. So it was very exciting to witness that.
Fairy
Um,
tale.
Yes, what I loved about Harry and Meghan's wedding was it was in Windsor, which is where I spent a huge part of my childhood, so it felt very personal. But also, I think there was a slightly more relaxed approach to it, which meant the people lining the long walk, which is that huge stretch of
Yes.
path that the carriage
Yes.
went up, there were Pym's tents set up and people were having picnics, and there was a real party atmosphere that was very exciting. And I think the British public were over the moon for Prince Harry. They were very excited about what Meghan represented for the nation as the first biracial member of the royal family, or biracial lady to be marrying into the royal family. It was a very optimistic time, and I think she reflected such a huge part of British society. So there was that added element that really made the day that bit just kind of historic, really, and just
Yes.
very, very exciting to witness firsthand.
Yes.
And that's really why I love my job so much, is because we're witnessing history
History,
firsthand.
exactly.
And
100%.
for the most part, other than funerals, which of course are dreadful occasions, but I feel like the royal family is really the only time there's a global news story other than the Olympics, but for a happy occasion. And I love that. Normally we're coming together as a community because there's been a devastating earthquake or hurricane or plane crash or terrorist attack. But when we look to the good news, I feel like it's the royal family and the Olympics, or a sort of big world sporting event, whether it's the football or the rugby, that really bring us together. And I like that about the family.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And you know, I've watched these both weddings, of course, at home from the TV. You know, I'm very partial about the protocol and knowledge of manners and etiquette. Can you please tell us a little bit about the most important protocol elements that have to be observed and have been observed for all the royal weddings?
Well, I think really it's observing the traditional Church of England marriage, because of course the Queen is head of the Church of England, and so it's important that they follow the traditional order of service. Of course, several brides have omitted saying obey in their vows. Diana famously sort of started that tradition. We'll say tradition loosely. And that's fine, but the rest of the service has very closely followed what the Church of England would require. But beyond that, there's not really, you know, people say you have to have sleeves. Well, when Zara Phillips married Mike Tyndall in 2011, she didn't have sleeves on her wedding dress. So the Queen wants you to have the kind of wedding that is going to feel personal to you, because again, she recognizes that it's a family occasion, albeit one shared with the rest of the world.
Yes.
So really it's the ceremony that is required to maintain the formality and the sense of tradition. But beyond that, she's very happy for royal brides, grooms as well, but let's face it, the brides are choosing most of the elements, for them to have a wedding that feels personal to them.
Wonderful. What are the most important rules of royal etiquette that you might want to point out that are of importance and that that have stood the test of time, I should say?
Well, I think, just behaving accordingly. So being dressed appropriately, not chewing gum, not smoking, and is sort of in front of them. Those are sort of the obvious ones. But I think a lot is often written about fashion and these sort of strict rules. Well, the Queen has preferences. So they're not rules per se, it's more preferences. So she prefers ladies to wear nude stockings when they're in her company. So For example, you'll see the royal ladies, whether it's Kate, Meghan, Sophie, Anne, if they're around the Queen, they will be wearing their nude stockings. But
Yeah.
it's not a hard and fast rule. If they're at another engagement and the Queen's
Yes.
not present, chances are they're not wearing their nude
Yes.
stockings.
Yes.
The same with hats. You know, it's really sort of following whatever the Queen's preferences
I
are. And
love
so
the hats.
I like to call it a preference more than a rule,
Yes.
because rules are something that you break, but the Queen's not a
Yeah.
dictator, and I think it's important people remember that.
Yes. And I know that I believe that Princess Sophie was named as one of the best dressed in Vanity Fair. I don't remember. I think it was in 2015 or 2016. And I really love her style. She's very, very fashionable. Who is your best dressed royal that you
Well, I
like
guess
from the
fashion
style?
is fashion's
Which
not really my forte, Olga. I have to be honest. But I think if I were to pick a style icon, it
style?
kind of would go between two. It would be Diana and Princess Margaret.
Yeah.
I loved Princess Margaret's evening gowns. You know, she was
Yes.
sort of, she really played up to being a
Yes.
princess. She owned her position, and I loved that about her. But I think there'll never be a style icon
Yeah.
quite like Diana. You know, what other royal could take a piece of jewelry, a necklace, and turn it into a headband?
Yes.
And you
True.
know, she was remarkable like
Yes.
that. So I think Diana's sort of in a league all her own for me, fashion wise.
Well, thank you for this uh, reply. Just a few general questions. Have you ever observed the Queen being stressed, and how does, in general, royal family, because they can't really show their emotions that much, how do they deal with stress, especially now during our days, during the pandemic, and we all are stressing and we all are full of anxiety?
Well, stress happens behind the scenes. They would never show that in public. But for the Queen privately, she'll go and walk her dogs, or she'll go and ride her horse. That's what she loves to do. That
Oh, that's
is,
wonderful.
or for the Queen to go and have a long walk across the Highlands in Scotland. You know, she'll put her headscarf on,
Yeah.
her raincoat on, her waterproof shoes on, and off she goes.
Yeah.
That's what they love to do. The royals love to be outside, and what they do share is their passion for dogs and horses, and nature. And all of them, if they need to de-stress, they're going to go on a long walk, and it doesn't matter the weather.
Yeah.
They really don't care about that. It's just about being in nature, where they can kind of throw off
Yeah.
their royal mantle and just sort of be free and quiet and serene.
That's well, this shares something very much in common with you. I know that you love animals, and
Yes.
especially cats, and you have many cats. So I can certainly, I'm sure that gives you the peace and tranquility, I'm sure, as well, and when you're sort of around them. A few just very personal questions so we can wrap up. I know that you have to rush and go to work as days
Got to get
just
to
time.
work, yes.
Yes, go to work. Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about your acting career and whether you're planning to act again at some point?
Oh no, I don't think so. I'd originally wanted to be a ballet dancer, and I trained as a ballet dancer. But when I was 18, I had a back injury that just meant that ballet just wasn't going to be possible. And I loved it, but it was like, okay, so I'm not going to be dancing, but I want to stay in this creative field. What next? And so I moved to New York to go to drama school, and I loved it. And when I left drama school, I did several plays, a few TV bits and pieces. But I sort of then naturally found myself sort of moving more and more towards television and hosting and presenting. And I loved that side of things more. I loved interacting with people on a much more personal level. We got to do some really phenomenal stories over the years. And I found it's not something that I knew I liked to do or wanted to do, but it's interesting. Steve Jobs, at a commencement speech many years ago, the Apple founder, he talked about your life being a series of dot to dots, and you don't sort of see the picture until all those dots have connected.
Yeah.
And I can see how the discipline of my ballet training led to acting and the disciplines that you need to incorporate, whether it's learning lines or being prepared or working as a team or showing up on time, and then how that evolved and helped serve the television career, and then being live in the moment and being, on stage or being in front of a camera talking to you live. They're similar. They require similar skills. And so I'm starting to sort of see how that picture's evolving now. But I love my job so much. I love what I do, and I feel a responsibility with so many inaccurate stories that are
Yeah.
peddled. I want to use my platform to be able to provide the historical context and analysis that sets those stories straight so that people could go, I love it when people, when they read my column each week and they say, I never knew X,
Yes.
Y, Z. That
Yes.
to me is really
Yes.
rewarding. So
Wonderful.
hopefully if life blesses me, I'll be able to continue in this sphere that I enjoy so much.
You absolutely will, and this is something that we have in common. I've studied history of arts, and I finished music school, and I played violin and piano, and I went to literature school. I'm not a writer. I don't really play anymore, although I love the music. So I expressed myself uh, through a different discipline, through creating
Right.
the magic, through creating the memories for people whom I love, and interaction is just like for you. It's extremely important for me. That's why pandemic and all the Zoom calls were really, really terrible for me personally, because I do need to have this personal touch and personal
Yeah.
interaction for sure. A few words and we will wrap up about your book. Um,
On the Queen.
yes,
Yes, yes. Well, I was thrilled to be asked. The History Press developed a series. It's the 100 greatest historical figures of all time, but people that have been a giant in their sphere. It's the Pocket Giant series. So Mozart, for example, the Dalai Lama. I think they've sort of pulled people from all walks of life and
yeah,
historical context that made a significant contribution in their field. Henry Ford, another one, Buddha. And
yes,
so I was asked to write the one on Queen Elizabeth II. And I think really when we look at her contribution, it's remarkable. She's broken so many records, many of which will never be, she set numerous records, excuse
yes,
me, many of which will never be broken. She was the first British consort to celebrate a diamond wedding anniversary. She's the first to next year mark a platinum jubilee.
yes.
She's created so many firsts and established so many unique records that we are very fortunate to have witnessed what I call the second Elizabethan age. And I think it's such a privilege to have been able to witness that. And so my book encompasses sort of it's an overview of her life and the most important elements of her life, and some of the records that she set and some of the things that she's achieved, and the highs and the lows in between.
Yes.
So I was very proud to be able to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria. I'm extremely proud to have you on
Oh, thank
Conversation with
you.
Olga, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for allocating the time and for being my guest tonight. And dear all, the episode will be recorded, and I will post it on my social media, and I'm also on a YouTube channel, and the link will be available just as for all the other episodes. And if you want to hear Victoria on another platform, please log into the One Way Ticket show that hosted by my friend Steven Shalovitz, and he has a conversation with Victoria as well. So please join us and join me for my next episode in a couple of weeks' time. And I'm sure I will be able to convince Victoria to talk to me once again, and
I'd
we'll
love
cover
to.
so many other subjects and topics that are really of interest to me personally and to so many others. Victoria, thank you once again very, very much. I'm wishing you a very good day. Please make sure that you drink a lot of water because it's very hot.
I
And
will do.
take care of yourself, and I'll talk to you very soon.
Olga, thank you. You've been a
Thank
charming
you.
host and I really enjoyed it. Thank you. And thank you to
Thank
everybody
you.
watching. Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye bye.